aggregate demand and aggregate supply. This is chapter 13. Now, it is always going to be dynamic. What does dynamic mean? Anybody? It has to do with movements of things over time. For instance, there's an amount of water in a lake, and then an amount flowing out over, say it's a dam, over the dam, and the dynamic part of it is the flow out of the lake. Or as one of my professors used as an example, there's an amount of beer in the keg, an amount of beer in the college student, and there's a flow rate between the two. The dynamic part is the flow rate. So I'm not going to say dynamic a lot, right? Because that's a lot to say each time, right? So I'm going to just say aggregate demand, aggregate supply, even that, but I'm going to abbreviate it ADAS, as we'll see in a minute. Now this is very, very different than demand and supply. The curves are going to look similar, but what's going on here is very different. And it turns out we've already had both the curves involved here. So first we're going to talk about dynamic aggregate demand. And it's going to be all combinations of inflation which we're going to abbreviate pi, and real growth, and I'm going to abbreviate little g, that are consistent with a particular level of spending. So we know we have from the chapter on the quantity equation and the price level, this MV equals PQ. I said at the time it's sort of a tautology, meaning it's always true. The left-hand side, money times the number of times it's spent, tells us what? The amount of spending there is. And the right-hand side is essentially nominal GDP, which is what? The amount of things purchased. Does spending have to equal does the value of purchases have to equal spending? Yeah. So, now, I'm going to do something that involves a little bit of arithmetic, maybe even algebra. maybe even calculus. If you haven't had calculus, don't worry about this too much. Worry about the end result. I'm going to take the natural log of both equations. The natural log is log to the base E. Not that you need to know that. But how many people vaguely remember from Algebra 2 or maybe even Algebra that if you take the log of things that are multiplied, what's true? They're added. Okay? The log of xy is the log of whatever base you use. Is just the log of x times the log of y. Logarithms are exponents, but you don't need to worry about that so much. And then I'm going to do the only bit of calculus I'm going to do here. I'm going to look at the change in the log of money over the change in time, change in the log of velocity over a change in time. And you can just think of those, if you haven't had calculus, just think of them as discrete changes. Calculus is saying the change in something, but you do it instantaneous. So, it turns out that time derivatives are growth rates. Natural log time derivatives are growth rates. So we get the percentage change in money plus the percentage change in velocity equals the percentage change in prices plus the percentage change in goods. So this is just money growth, the change in velocity. What is this? That's our inflation rate, and this is our growth rate. So we already had the growth rate and inflation rate that we're going to use. And really, what did we say? Velocity changes generally very little. People's spending generally stays the same, although there are times it really does change dramatically, right? What happened when they started shutting down the economy around COVID? What happened to the money that people had? Well, they tried to hold it. It didn't go. They tried to hold on to it as much as they could, except maybe buying toilet paper. But people tried to hold on to money because you don't know, right? Rather than go spend it to go see a movie, you might hold on to it because you don't know how long your job's going to be shut down. So there are times when it changes a lot, but in general, it's pretty stable. What's true about the growth of the economy? 2.5%, 3% is really good. 1% is terrible. Negative 1% is awful. So it does not vary a lot. Right? You can't, again, the central bank, as I said from the first day, the central bank doesn't have a magic production wand. The central bank can't, or nothing can really make us, right? We know this from GPA management, right? How many times have you sworn to yourself you're going to get a 4.0 this semester, despite being a 3.2 student or 2.8 student? And we are really who we are, right? So you're swearing to yourself the beginning of the semester lasts a week, and we are who we are. I don't know if there's anybody in the class here who has 2 or 3 jobs, works all the time, is unhappy if they're not out working. people like that just work. All of us aren't like that. We wouldn't be very happy with 3 jobs and no time to ourselves. Some people are like me and particularly lazy and happy never to do anything. So we are who we are. You can't magically change that. In fact, that's part of why capital comes in. The biggest way to magically change it is to give somebody tools so that for the same effort they can produce more. But, so an implication of this is, I have to run next door and get so if money growth equals 6% and velocity growth equals -1%, that implies the left-hand side is 5%. What's got to be true about the right-hand side?
5%.
It's got to be somehow 5%. So if percentage change in Q or little q or little g equals 3%, then percentage change in prices, or pi, has to equal 2%. Why don't you just have a way of getting at how much demand there is in the economy? All right, spending is going to be demand. So we've got a particular model. We've got inflation rate on one axis, real GDP growth rate on the other axis. And basically, if inflation goes up to 3%, what has to happen to real GDP growth in our model? Got to go down to 2%. The right-hand side has to stay the same. So that's just telling you that the aggregate demand curve has to look something like that, right? If we've got, now, and I can illustrate something, usually I wait to tell you later on this, but if this is 2% inflation, then this is 3% growth. If inflation rises to 3%, and this drops to 2% growth. What is this telling you from a practical point of view? And the fact that these GDP numbers are really small. I really should draw the aggregate demand curve like way in here, right? But that's not going to be very practical. It won't be worthwhile. But just keep in mind, as I draw these, we're talking about very small numbers of growth. I guess you could say I could change the scale on the various axes. Now, obviously, what's going to cause our curve to shift? What might cause aggregate demand to go out here? That's, just given the structure of this class, while, again, this is very different. This is the demand for all goods in the economy. It's the price. It's the inflation rate in the economy. So we're not talking about an individual market. talking about the economy as a whole. But the natural thing to look at next is what things cause aggregate demand to shift. So what was the last letter I had up here? C?
Yeah.
Okay.
The B was the last one, so C's next.
Hmm?
C is next.
C is next. All right, so shifters. For dynamic aggregate demand. Well, obviously, sort of the first two we have to have on here are what? Money and velocity, right? So we have them here, money growth is one. And money growth up implies aggregate demand up. And you know, most people don't think about you know, people don't naturally think about the velocity or the turnover rate of money, and then, you know, maybe I should have said that, right? Velocity is how often money is spent. It's interesting that I was just thinking about this the other day. I was talking to somebody about this. It's interesting that we use V for velocity, and in physics, right, it's E equals mc squared. I guess C is the velocity of light. It comes from the Latin word for speed. I looked it up after I had this conversation. So in some ways, with the, you know, some of it is the, you know, I guess by the 19th century, when the equations started getting written down in economics, it was more, English was the language of science. Previously, in the 16th century, in the 1500s, when Newton started writing things down for physics, it was more Latin, so they went to use Latin abbreviations. So velocity is easier for us. So I put, in my notes, I have confidence / fear, but this is really velocity. Right? If you're confident you're going to get more money, you'll make more money than the money you have, you'll spend. Confident more money's coming in. If you're fearful that you're going to lose your job, which is what happens in recessions, then what happens to your spending? You slow it down. On the other hand, if you're fearful that prices are going to keep rising, what do? You spend the money today before it loses its value. Right? In the extreme cases of hyperinflations in Europe, the Germans were paid at noon so they could spend the money before it lost all its value by 5 o'clock. So they spent their first half day's work money during their lunch break. So this one's a little bit complicated, but I mean, we can say fear of losing job implies aggregate demand down, right? But it depends on the type of fear. What happens to wealth if there's a change in wealth? Wealth up. Right? You're a modest Dungeons and Dragons player. Successful locally. Go to the clubs, etc. All of a sudden the Dungeons and Dragons League is organized and you're the #1 draft choice. What's happened to your wealth? Right? The #1 draft choice in the NFL is really, really wealthy. Why? Why? Because a lot of us watch it. If we all turn from the NFL, because they keep making the rules too convoluted for anyone to understand, and we go to watching Dungeons and Dragons, which I don't understand the least bit, or whatever, I don't know. I guess there are people who actually do make money on these online video games playing them, right? So, maybe you could become a pro in that, but your wealth all of a sudden is great. If you win, if you had been lucky enough, nobody here from New Jersey, right? Nobody here in New Jersey last week buying was it Mega Millions or Powerball? I think it was Mega Millions. A Mega Millions ticket for $1.2 billion, or for $1 or $2 to get 1.2 million, 2 billion. So if you won 1.2 billion, what's happened to your wealth? Gone up. What do you think happens to the amount of spending you do? You know, your wealth doesn't really go up until you actually get the money, but what's going to happen to your spending? Yeah, you're going to be more confident about spending your money. So wealth up implies aggregate demand up. Growth in taxes. What are taxes?
Money taken from the people giving it.
Money taken from, this is very important because when we talk about aggregate supply, we're going to talk about tax rates. Of the next dollar you earn, how much does the government take? But the government, you know, I had this academic girlfriend who was at the University of New Hampshire, so I went up there to visit for a year, and we were on semesters, so I taught we were on quarters here. So I taught winter quarter, spring quarter, and then fall semester. So essentially I taught, what is that? 2/3 plus a half would be 3/6 plus 2/6, no. 3/6 plus 4/6. So I taught 7/6, right? So I made more than my annual salary. So I made a little bit more, so I was bitching about my taxes, as we like to bitch about our taxes. And my friend, her little brother was somehow hanging, which she's from Miami, was hanging out with this really rich lawyer that he met somehow, I don't know how. But anyway, that guy, this was in the 80s, paid $650,000 in federal income tax that year. So if the government takes $650,000 from him, what happened to his spending? It was necessarily $650,000 less. So growth in taxes, if that goes up, then aggregate demand, dynamic aggregate demand goes down. So, growth in government spending. If the government spends more money, what's true? If government spending growth goes up, that implies aggregate demand goes up. Right? If the government spends, that's demand in the economy, right? right? If the national government buys up a bunch of bullets, buys a bunch of paper, hires a bunch of people, whatever, that's demand in the economy. Notice these two imply what? The government budget deficit. So we will look at these, we'll look at the government budget in a, that's sort of the last chapters we do, we'll look at the government budget, but we're talking about them indirectly here. We haven't defined it all yet, but clearly, if the government spends more, then there's more demand in the economy. That may lead to greater production, but it may lead to more inflation. And export growth. And if it's up, that implies aggregate demand up. Right? If foreigners are buying more of our products, if there's an increased demand for our products from foreigners, then that's more demand in our economy. And
More money to spend. More money to spend.
well,
I know in our house it is.
well, it could just raise the price of everything you buy. Again, it matters whether production can go up or not. And import growth. Up implies aggregate demand down, and the two of these together are the current account balance, or really the balance of trade. Right? If the balance of trade is more in surplus, that means there's more demand in our economy. Okay, everybody think they understand those? What do you think the chances there'll be a question about something shifting aggregate demand on the test is? Pretty high. What do we need to do next? What we're doing next is sort of repetitive, but what do we need to do next?
Aggregate supply.
Yeah, we have to talk about aggregate supply. Right, so we'd already done aggregate demand previous to this class, previous to the last test. Even though I made the last test seem pretty easy, we did get aggregate demand because we did the quantity equation. We talked about the quantity equation in that chapter. comes from the solo growth model. So it's the potential growth in the economy due to increased ideas, increased labor, increased productivity of labor. So, now, think back to your last test and that solo growth model, that model of the production function with investment and depreciation. What role did the inflation rate have on that graph? Anybody? None. It wasn't there. I guess all of you want credit for that, right? So all of you answered it correctly since the answer was none. No, but right, think about it. Did we have inflation there anywhere? No. So we have a vertical aggregate supply curve. So it's vertical unless something changes. Or vertical at least in the long run. We'll talk about when it might not be vertical. That's going to be an important part of this, but to start off, we want to talk about it as vertical. Right, because saying it's vertical is saying what? Saying
Steady.
green piece, no, it's saying green pieces of paper don't produce anything. Right? If the government sent us each a check for $1 million, what would happen? Price of everything would go up, right? Unless more things are made. And in fact, if the government sent most of us $1 million, what would be the first thing that would happen? Particularly if we didn't think through that everyone was getting $1 million. Well, I'm in Fat City. I wanted to take notes, but screw this. I have to take an economics class. I'm done. All right? There's going to be some tendency to work less if the government sends us all $1 million. And of course, now, I sort of assumed everybody followed the downward sloping aggregate demand curve shifts up and to the right. That's an increase. This is going to be an increase in aggregate supply because the growth rate is higher. We went from G1 to G2, 2% to 3%. Right? Things to the right on the horizontal axis of the number line are bigger numbers. And then, of course, we have to talk about shifters here. We may do slightly different verbiage, but we've really already talked about this, right? If you want to increase the growth rate, what do you got to do? What are the things we already know that I'm not going to put down? Or I'm going to put down indirectly? You got to increase the number of ideas, right? How can the government increase the number of ideas? Protecting intellectual property rights, patents, copyrights, trade secrets, or subsidizing. You know, that's basically what they can do. But there are some other things that can affect aggregate supply that are outside of the control of the government. Bad weather, maybe climate change, one question right there. Why do I have question marks there?
That's no D notice for certain, let's have another.
Yeah, when I was at the University of New Hampshire that year, I once drove to Quebec City. And I drove through Maine to Quebec City. Pretty weird state. People would drive by with deer or bears thrown over their front fender tied down, coming back from hunting. But I hit this little town in Maine, heading up to Quebec City, Canada. And this little town had a sign. That sign, and we might have been north of the top of New Hampshire, maybe not quite to the, Maine sticks up further than New Hampshire. But just to give you an idea where we are, we're the top of New Hampshire, maybe plus or minus a few miles. And the town had a sign. Anybody guess what the sign said? You are halfway between the equator and the North Pole. So if the Earth warmed up a little bit, there's a lot of land up there. There's a lot of Canada. I think Canada's a fair amount bigger than the U.S. in size, in square miles. Right? On the other side of the world, there's Siberia. There's a lot of land in Siberia if things warmed up. So it's not completely clear what's going to happen. I don't know. I guess the people that theorize about the polar ice caps melting have never abandoned a glass of iced tea or never had driven a car in the north. What do we know about water when it freezes and melts? Well, if you leave a glass of iced tea that's pretty full and the ice all melts, what happens? Does it spill over? You don't put antifreeze in your car and you're far enough north, what happens?
Huge increases.
Well, but the engine you can just let it melt. It expands. So when ice is one of the few things that when it gets cold, it gets bigger, and when it gets warm, it gets smaller. I'll get rid of this. So, I guess we're not going to get flooded from the melting ice caps anyway, so that's what that sounds like to me. But maybe there's something different about Arctic ice. I'm not a climate scientist. So, maybe, but If we have bad weather and we have a bad growing season, what happens to output?
Yes, down.
Yeah. Worse weather implies aggregate supply down, right? If it doesn't rain so much, what happens with construction crews? They get more built, right? So good weather can lead to more productivity, bad weather can lead to worse productivity. Rising input prices. And the key one usually is oil. The price of oil up implies aggregate supply down. You know, I guess it could be people. You know, it can be the price of labor also. People become more expensive. And what could cause people to be more expensive? Fewer kids, which people are having fewer kids. Makes labor more scarce in the future. Or everybody deciding to stay home and take care of their kids and not put them in daycare. I don't know. Religious revival, causing everyone to say, no, I'm not going to work on Sunday, or I'm not going to work on from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. Reduce the amount people could work. And, you know, your boss can fire you if you do it yourself, but if the society does it, then they're just sort of stuck adapting to it. Changes in productivity. Productivity up. Implies aggregate supply up. Whether it's machines being more productive or people being more productive, or a combination, right? If you can produce more in the same hours, then you'll have them. Changes in tax rates. Tax rate up, tax rates up implies aggregate supply down, particularly income tax rates. Right, if you tax something, you get less of it. For this reason, economists like what kind of taxes? Anybody know? Economists like poll taxes. Or economists like head taxes. You exist, therefore you must give us $50. Because that doesn't change your behavior. Doesn't affect your behavior. Nobody else but economists like it. Like the public hates them. Public's like income or sales tax. So, and they do change behavior. If you tax sales, what happens? People buy less because they got to pay the tax. If you tax income, people work less because they've got to, you know, they don't get as high a reward for work. changes in government regulation. Regulations up imply aggregate supply down. The more regulations you have to comply with, the less you're going to supply. Makes it more difficult to supply. Makes it more expensive to supply.
Makes it take longer.
Makes it take longer. Changes in natural disasters. Pretty obvious around here, right? What and where you would build if we have one hurricane every 3 years is different than if we have one hurricane every 3 months. Right? After the hurricanes, the last time I rebuilt my fence, at some point I might go without the fence if it got knocked down all the time. So, disasters up imply aggregate supply down. Now, there is a little bit of a counterintuitive thing. I mean, what happens right after a natural disaster? You rebuild. So in some ways it causes it, but again, if they happened every month, right? What would happen to the GDP of California if they had an earthquake every month? Yeah, people would leave, right? What happened to the GDP? What was the island in the Caribbean that had the volcano and essentially 70% of the population left? Right, it happened, I think, in the 80s, maybe, right? Places can become unlivable due to natural disasters. And of course, health. And this is sort of health of the population in general. If you're a less healthy population, what's going to be true?
Production will go down.
Yeah, you're going to produce less. I guess I should say health changes. So, if the population gets less healthy, I think I've given the example of sub-Saharan Africa a couple of times in here where AIDS got into the general population and just killed sub-Saharan African growth for a decade. COVID had the potential, doesn't seem to really be affecting us much now. Maybe the latest strain is milder. The dominant strain now is milder. How many people, anybody in here not have COVID?
Like ever?
Ever, that you know of?
Because you know about it.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're also building up immunity. Before, nobody had any immunity to it.
Yeah. But it, doesn't seem to be as bad as even the flu in terms of knocking you out for a couple of weeks or a week.
It did me
Did you?
in January.
All right, as with regular supply and demand, we can put these two together. Diane, what's the chance you'll have a true-false question about the things that cause aggregate supply to shift? Very high, as with aggregate demand. Well, maybe, I don't know where this came from, so I'm asking for trouble. Hopefully I dropped it sometime in here. So, we put these together and we get a GDP growth rate, say something like 2.5%. We get an inflation rate, something like 5%. And that's pretty close to what they were over the last year. We have a description of the economy. What do we care about in the economy? Is the pie getting bigger? What's happening to inflation? What do we care about the most? Is the pie getting bigger? But of course, if we aren't getting pay raises, the inflation starts mattering because it affects how much of the pie we can get. But you gotta have the pie growing, right? Otherwise what? Right, all the doomsday things, all the doomsday books and TV shows. What good is your money when society breaks down? You know, if nothing's produced, you can't really buy things. So we have a description of an economy. You know, there's some other things you could talk about, like the exchange rate, the interest rate, etc. But ultimately what we care about is how many goods there are out there. You might care about the unemployment rate, but the more goods that are produced, the lower the unemployment rate's going to be. The faster the growth in the economy, the lower the unemployment rate's going to tend to be. So we discovered we really had all of this prior to the last test. We put it together and made that dynamic aggregate supply and dynamic aggregate demand, and we've got a model to give us an inflation rate and a GDP growth rate. And as with supply and demand, we can draw out and show a number of different cases. And our model, aggregate demand up, what happens? Well, growth stays at G1, inflation goes from pi 1 to pi 2. When does a time like this happen? When did we see inflation going up without much change in output? Growth staying about the same, growth being about normal. 2021, 22, maybe even 23. Today, really, we'll see whether in 24 the output goes down, but today, famously, the 1960s, 1950s and 60s if you want. What if the opposite occurs? Aggregate demand falls. What happens to the inflation rate? It falls, maybe even becomes negative. When did we see this in history? 1880s and 90s? Well, let's say 1870s and 80s. When you fight a war, if you're a government, what are some of the problems you have in terms of economics if you fight a war? You got to pay for it. In the United States, there's at least some resistance now for paying for the Ukrainian war, but it's not really our war. When you have it, well, it's not really our, one of the big problems you have is, okay, you need more money, right? You gotta command more of the resources in the economy, so what can you do? You could raise taxes, you could take money away. But from the public, but that's a harder sell when you're also sending the public out that bullet shot at them. Right, see, it's a somewhat of a hard sell on the Ukrainian war thing, but nobody's shooting any bullets at us, right? Nobody's shooting any bullets at your kids or your brother or sister, right?
No, but
People are pretty resistant to,
I look at it from a historical perspective, being a history major.
well,
So it's kind of,
I understand you can look, that, but it's still, it's different when they're shooting at you, you're even more resistant. So, a way that governments pay for wars is by inflating the economy. Now, previous to World War II, maybe World War I, I don't know, take your pick. Money was viewed as a contract between government and the money holders. So after the Civil War and the Reconstruction period in the United States brought down the price level to go back on the gold standard at par. So the value of a dollar in 1859 and the value of a dollar whenever they got it done in the 1880s was the same. That if you held your money throughout, you didn't lose any money. Modern governments don't care. And maybe we're right not to care, we'll see later on, but that's what they did. So that's what was happening. They were deflating the economy reducing the price level to go back on gold at the pre-war par. All right. Now, what if aggregate supply decreases? I made it decrease so that growth became negative. But even if it just decreases, growth will still go down. So aggregate supply down. I guess I should call this 2 to be consistent with the other ones. Implies growth down. Right? When have we seen this? Oil price shocks, 1974, late 70s, and then of course COVID. Right? What happened to the economy in the year 2020? It went way down, yeah. And did things get more expensive? When the economy went way down, did your toilet paper get less costly?
Eggs went up.
Well, some of that stuff was later, so we'll talk about it. But in general, things became more expensive too, because there were less goods around. And last but not least, if aggregate supply increases, what happens? Growth up, inflation down. I should have said here, inflation up, because it does cause inflation to go up. When did we see things like this, aggregate supply increasing? This also happened sort of, 1880s, 1890s, the Industrial Revolution time, maybe the 1980s. This is sort of, if you're a politician, what do you want? Do you want inflation rising? Do you want deflation? Do you want inflation higher and growth lower? Do you want inflation higher and growth lower, or do you want growth higher and inflation lower? This is the one that you're looking for if you're a politician. People are unhappy there's inflation here. People are unhappy there's deflation here. This is the worst of all possible world. What happens here? Robespierre becomes a national hero, and we pull out and polish up the guillotines and get rid of the politicians. Right, that's the kind of thing that leads to revolution in the streets. All right, you guys can go. We'll play around.